This is Deepu Parekh with Ravi Brahmat and Dr. Paul Wagner. We are the former students of Dr. Wagner's ethics class from UHCL. Dr. Wagner, today's conversation is focused on leadership as moral architecture. Would you please enlighten us on the subject, leadership as moral architecture?
All right, now let's start with the term moral architecture because I think it's pretty new in literature. In fact, I think I'm the one that created it. Most of the articles that I wrote even before the book were the first ones to ever use that term. If you remember in the past couple of sessions, we talked about morality and the foundation of morality. All right. So I'm going to start there, and I want you to consider the image of a great Egyptian pyramid or a Mayan or an Aztec pyramid. And on the foundation, it's very solid platform, we'll say, and think of that as morality. The foundation of morality is the foundation of that pyramid. And what that means is that cooperation, which every herd animal has, is its evolutionary ace in the hole. That cooperation is that foundation. And what makes that foundation particularly resilient for human beings is the invention of the promise. So from the invention of the promise, we have networks of promising that obligate us to one another. And then the last time we spoke, I gave the example of the Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu talking to the student who thought because a rule had been broken that either way he was going to break some kind of a rule, and so that was a conflict of morality. And his mentor had to say to him, "You don't understand the point of morality." Well, the point of morality begins with a foundation, just like a great pyramid had to start with a foundation. That foundation is cooperation, a network of promising. And now we're going to go up a few feet from that foundation. And to make promising work, one of the things that has to take place is certain virtues surround the making of promises. You wouldn't even bother to make promises with somebody who you thought was untrustworthy, nor would somebody make a promise with you if they thought you were untrustworthy. And we ought to be careful about what promises we make because we also know when we make promises, we're obligating ourselves. That is to say, we're duty bound to follow through on those things that we promise. Other virtues seem to surround this idea of promising, such as loyalty. If you are among a group of people that you find to be disloyal, you're not going to expect many promises to be made among anybody. Um, in addition, honesty. How can you rely on the promises that you make or that other people make if the people making promises are disloyal? I mean, not disloyal, but dishonest, or they lack integrity. Or it's also the case that there are grounds for violating a promise made at times because of unforeseen circumstances. But what are the grounds for excusing properly a promise made? So that's kind of like the next layer on that pyramid as we move up from the foundation. We find these virtues are laid upon the foundation and take us a little bit higher. Now I want to go a little bit further. With those virtues in mind, we come up with some very uh, nearly universal and probably universal moral rules eventually. I gave an example yesterday of I think it's wrong. The best of my knowledge is that slavery is wrong. I can't guarantee the truth of anything, but when I reach for the truth in the moral world, I think slavery is one of the things that I get to touch when I get really close to actually touching truth. So really major moral rules like slavery is wrong, murder is wrong. Murder, by the way, is not killing. It's a type of killing. It's killing with malicious intent. So murder is wrong. Um, grand larceny, that means stealing a lot from somebody, is wrong. Stealing a much smaller amount, but from somebody who can barely afford to lose it, surely that's got to be among those major, that is a wrong sort of thing to do. So on top of the virtues, as we start moving up our pyramid, we find some big time moral rules that pretty much encompass the globe. There's a very famous bioethicist at Dartmouth University by the name of Bernard Gert, and he wrote a book called The Moral Rules. And in studies that he had done, he thought after studying over 3,000 cultures, historic and current, he had found 11 moral rules that are essentially inviolate, which means that nobody breaks these 11 rules. They're just true across the board, except for 5 cultures. And he wanted to say, and these cultures aren't even real cultures. They're really subcultures. For example, the Nazis of Nazi Germany were a small group of what you would find in German culture. And one of the rules, for example, at that level would be incest. Wherever you go in the world, incest is usually frowned upon. Certainly people do it, but people also murder. But when people murder, we say they're doing a wrong thing. When people engage in incest, we say they're doing the wrong thing. Um, in Nazi Germany, if incest was more common, that would just tell us that that subculture got the rules wrong. Bernard Gert has no trouble with saying, after examining over 3,000 cultures and finding only 5 that violate his 11 moral rules, of saying of those subcultures that they are simply wrong. And he said, isn't that common sense? Imagine this. Take 100 people, just like the listeners to this lecture, and give them a simple arithmetic test. Add, subtract, simple multiplication and division, no word problems, no equations, and just 100 questions. And if you turn in a perfect paper, you're going to get $100. Now you have to solve all the problems at one sitting, but you can take as long as you want. It's not a time test. So if you want to sit there for 4 hours going over your 100 arithmetic problems before turning it in, because you want that $100, you're going to work pretty hard at it. But let's imagine there's 100 people just like you doing the same thing. 100 people are doing 100 arithmetic problems, and every one of them that turns in a perfect paper gets $100. This is pretty cool. You wouldn't be surprised, however, would you, if it turned out that 2 or 3 of the people made a mistake. And that's what we would call it. They made a mistake. They missed a couple of problems. Oh, they were trying to be so conscientious. But people make mistakes. Now, if you're not surprised that out of 100 people with a lot of motivation to do a rather simple task might make some simple mistakes, then you certainly ought not to be surprised when out of 3,000 cultures, 5, and they're even smaller, almost subcultures rather than real cultures, 5 subcultures got some things wrong. So that's the way Gert would take a look at that. All right, so we're going up our pyramid. And so on top of our virtues, which they're all set up on top of our foundation, we have some major moral rules that we say we can pretty well count upon as being reliable and being a close approximation of truth. And they tell us things that we ought to do when we ask that simple question, how ought I to treat others? Well, now we move up another layer. And what's the other layer? Well, the next layer up is a layer of sanctions and punishments. If people break the rules, we may have punishments for them, right? And say, oh, you you murdered somebody. You didn't just kill them or just beat them up. You murdered them. And so we're going to put you in jail for life, or perhaps two worse. Um, but that's a punishment, and that rests atop the moral rule that says you ought not to commit murder. We also, at that level, we start using social conventions in addition to our punishments to moderate and to restrain ourselves from some of those moral violations that may not even be accompanied by formal punishments. So, for example, I mentioned the terms shame and ashamed before. If you do something wrong, as philosopher Immanuel Kant would say, or the Harvard philosopher Christina Horsgaard would say, if you do something wrong, you ought to feel guilt. Guilt is the natural consequence of wrongdoing. In psychiatry, we define a sociopath simply as someone who has no sense of conscience. They simply don't feel guilt, regardless of what they do. And so we give that a fancy sounding medical name, call it a sociopath. But in our context here, we would say what they've done is they violated a moral rule. And in normal cases, the person is going to feel guilt. They will feel ashamed that they did that. The few people who don't feel ashamed, they're a psychiatric abnormality. Now, we have another word, shame, not the same as ashamed. Shame is what the community does to a violator of these moral rules. So if we find somebody who has acted beastly toward others, toward a bully who beats up the smallest kids in the class on a regular basis, the rest of the class can sometimes control that bully, not by force, but by ostracizing the bully, by shaming him. He doesn't feel guilt for what he has done to these kids. He may very well feel being shamed by his classmates who really don't want to have much to do with him as long as he continues to behave in that fashion. You see how this pyramid is going up? Now, after we get above those rules, we get to a next and our highest level of rules. And they're a funny sort of rule. They're not directly a moral rule. They're even less. So we got our moral rules, we got our conventions. They're even less than conventions, and that's our rules of etiquette. And rules of etiquette, interestingly enough, belong in a pyramid, and they're close to the top. Let me give you an example of rules of etiquette. With the COVID-19, we may touch elbows now instead of shaking hands. And I believe in India, the way you might greet someone is namaste. I got that right? Did I say it right? And which is a beautiful saying that goes along with that. Um, I bought a truck one time from a fellow from Japan, and when the deal was all done, and we did it at a sunroom outside of his house, I approached him. I had given him my check. He had given me the pink slip, and so the truck was mine. And so I wanted to honor his cultural background and has certain rules of etiquette. And he wanted to do the same for me, although I didn't know he was going to do this. So as we approached one another, I stopped and I bent over and bowed. And at that very moment, he's standing straight up and he put his hand out to shake my hand. So I realize he's got his hand out. He realizes I'm bowed over. So he bows halfway down. I come up halfway in my bow, and we're shaking hands, and both of us are bowed over halfway. Now, what was important about that is each of us were trying to follow a rule of etiquette because we respected the other fellow. We respected the fact that we had transacted business in good conscience and in a respectful way toward one another. And we wanted to show one another, even at the very end, I'm happy with how this has been done. I want to please you by acknowledging the rules of etiquette that would be common in your cultural background. and we both second guessed the other one, and so we kind of came up with a mishmash of rules of etiquette that we put together. But that didn't matter. What really mattered was that we were trying. And so now that takes us up to the very peak of the pyramid, and it gets us to our topic of leadership. At the very peak of that pyramid, it's a lot of the small stuff that really matters. A leader is a moral architect. The leader is the one who takes a look at the foundation and builds up the pyramid. The Mayan pyramids and the Aztec pyramids don't look exactly like the Egyptian pyramids, but we can still imagine what they're doing. They're going from a large, strong foundational base up to ever smaller. But the architecture is a little bit different. The leader designs the architecture. The foundation of morality is always the same. That central question, how ought I to treat others, is always the same. And the leader ought to be someone for whom that question matters a lot. But the leader has to be very attentive to all the layers that go up above that. And at the very top, that leader is somebody who goes out of his way to say please and thank you. You're very kind. I appreciate that. That sort of behavior tops it all off. It's even above rules of etiquette, but it's little extra courtesies that let everybody know that this leader is truly about living a life robustly embracing the entire pyramid of moral architecture. And so everyone knows he can be counted on from that foundation all the way up to even above rules of etiquette, just a simple things, just a simple courtesies, as we might say. They might hold the door open for us as we're trying to get through with a bundle of books in our hand. And so that leader who lives that way will be role modeled by subordinates. The leader who tries to take shortcuts on it all and think, well, just because I'm boss, I can tell people midway up the pyramid, these are the rules we'll follow, and these are the punishments that'll happen if you don't follow them. That leader won't be a leader for long. The best that that person can hope for is to simply be boss. And no one will be following that leader. They will only be following along because it's too inconvenient to confront the leader's, the boss's power, but they won't be following him. A true leader is somebody that, as Eisenhower had said, other people will follow. And that true leader has to lead from the very top of the pyramid and understand the pyramid from its base, the very top, and be the sort of person who says, thank you. It's quite kind of you. You're very gracious. I appreciate that.
So would you say that it's kind of like a required skill for today's higher ed administrators?
I don't even know that it's a skill. I think it's deeper than that. You might have a skill of doing certain types of arithmetic. Might be good at calculus. That's a skill. You might be a good critical thinker. That's a skill too. But I think this being the leader who really lives from the bottom up to the top of that pyramid, it's a state of being. It's a state of being. I think I hope we've all met really good people in our life. I mean, really good people in our life. And they've probably been so few and far between, we can kind of think about them, call them to mind because they are so different from so many of the rest of us. But we know when we're in the presence of a good person, we stand in awe and admiration of them from time to time because we look at them and go, that person is just, that's just really a good person. I've never met Mother Teresa, but when I've read stories about her, I mean, there she was in her 70s, and I know how sore the body can get when one gets into one's 70s. And here she's running what was essentially a hospice for people who were dying in Calcutta, and so they just didn't die out in the street or whatever. And so she would try to make them comfortable, provide beds for them, and some nutrition, at least to keep them comfortable and so on. She'd already won the Nobel Prize in Peace Prize and got her $1 million. And what did she do with it? Did she go out and buy herself a Porsche? No, the little old nun didn't do that. She took that $1 million and just spent it on the poor people of Calcutta, the whole kit and caboodle. She didn't even get herself a new nun's outfit. She spent it on the poor people. And the story goes that one night the hospice was filled with sick and dying people, and another person came in who was very ill. And Mother Teresa, who was sleeping on a bed that was made out of wood and with essentially a long sack filled with straw and hay, was her mattress. This 70-year-old nun gets up and gives her bed to the patient, and she lay down on the floor. And I try to be a good person from time to time, but I can't even imagine being a Mother Teresa type of person. So I can't help but stand back in awe and reverence in the presence of such a person or tales about such a person and go, man, that's a darn good person. And I'm going to listen to that person when it comes to asking that big question, how ought we to treat one another? You may recall in our first session, I talked about the great corporate leader that I had dinner with when I was consulting with his firm. And I asked him, what would get you to follow somebody else? And he couldn't think of it. He kept on coming up with little tricks and jingoist talk like, oh, shared vision, and oh, we're going to, all the language that we throw out there in our management theories and so on. And then when I finally said to him integrity, he brightened up and he said, you're right. That's what would make me follow somebody else. But then he slid right back to where he came from, the trickster. And he said, so how do I convince them I got integrity? Integrity isn't something you do with a trick. You don't convince people you got integrity because you said a few things, or you wore the right clothes, or you told the right jokes. You show integrity. Mother Teresa didn't have to tell us how we're supposed to live or anything else like that. She just lived her life with integrity. And we could look at her and go, I know I ought to try to live more like that. She was a leader too. She got a whole bunch of women, literally from around the world, who joined her group of nuns to do the kind of thing she's doing. Who would follow somebody like that? Well, Eisenhower got it right. You follow someone like that because you recognize them as a leader, not a boss. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah,
Well,
so it's reminds me of stories while growing up, going to school in India. Mahatma Gandhi, another leader, even Mandela. None of those people had to ask anyone to follow them, but people were just drawn to their mission, to their purpose of in life. There's so many other people. Like I think if you remember, one of the discussions was about, I guess, recent leaders, and I consider Henry Ford a great leader because he was one of those people that felt that empathize with people. So what I
Martin Luther
wanted
King,
to, sorry,
Martin
sorry,
Luther King Jr. was one of those too,
yes,
because
yes,
he walked the talk, as the young folks like to say. He walked the talk, and he was committed to not getting back at those who had offended him. He wasn't committed to trying to, even up the odds and put up your dukes. I'm here to fight. He was here to win through force of integrity and leadership. And he even tells us when he looks at his own children, don't judge my children by the color of their skin. That's wrong. He's drawing a line in the sand there. He's telling us that's wrong. But he continues that sentence in his very famous Eye of a Dream speech. by saying, but do judge them by the content of their character. So he's recognizing it's important to judge even his own kids by the content of their character. That does matter, and that should be judged. And implicitly, he's also saying to us, judge me by the content of my character, but don't judge me because of the color of my skin or because I'm a preacher and you're an atheist or whatever else it might be. Judge me by my character.
So, Dr. Wagner, would you agree when I say good leaders or true leaders are an endangered species at the current time?
Oh gosh, I don't know that requires speculation, and I try to avoid speculation because the stuff that I talk about gets very close to the well, that's your opinion, that's my opinion, and I don't want to cross that line. So I want to talk about those kinds of things for which there is good, solid argument to substantiate the claims that I might make, and any claim I might make about where we are now or where we're going in the future. A dime and a cup of coffee will get you just as good of an opinion from somebody else. So I kind of want to shy away from that.
Okay, so going back to the leadership, educational leadership, four corners that you talked about in class for educational purpose: skills, attitude, information, and disposition.
Mm-hmm.
If today's leader and higher ed administrator, if they don't have all four of those corners secured, they still create a moral architecture in their organization?
It will. Um, have you ever tried to build a little house using popsicle sticks? And if you have, you know how perilous it is. And there's all sorts of games where I think it's called Chucka or whatever. You have these little blocks all piled up, and you're supposed to pull out one block at a time. And the person who finally causes the whole thing to tip over loses. Well, you can build an architecture that's flawed. You know, there are buildings and there are bridges that fall down because they were flawed architectures from the beginning. Bad engineering was involved, whatever. And so, yeah, there's what I call a flat architecture. The person who thinks to himself, might makes right. Now I'm the boss. Can't make everybody happy, so either you get in line or you get out. Well, people may follow along with that person, but that's a flat architecture. And as soon as that person winds up getting in trouble, all those people who are following along, they're like, I don't know you, buddy. You're on your own now. So there was no leadership there. So, in a sense, architecture is anytime we have a community, there's going to be a moral architecture of some kind. The question will be, is it going to be that pyramid I described? And the thicker and taller it is, probably the better. Or it can be very flat. And the might makes right is a very flat architecture because that foundation is almost ignored. You just plop right down, you ignore the virtues. You ignore the virtues. And you just plop down on that foundation the rules that everyone has to live by. And all rules are the same, ranging from do not murder to get your lesson plans in on time.
So going in the same direction but a lower level, in your opinion, um, is there a difference between schooling and education? And if yes, what is that difference?
I think there's a great difference in it. And I'll give you a cute quotation to start the difference rather than give you something lofty. Guy by the name of Mark Twain. I'm sure you heard of Mark Twain. Everyone's heard of Mark Twain, you know, our famous wise guy from the 19th century. Mark Twain once said, and I kind of lived my life this way, by the way. Mark Twain once said, I always tried to keep my schooling from interfering with my education. And I think that was brilliant. And as I say, I think I tried to live my own life that way. I was not the kind of student that was happy to be lectured at and then given a multiple choice test to see if I had gotten what it is that the other person who was training me wanted me to deliver. I was usually way ahead of the class in whatever we were going to read because I would read it on my own. It was usually good stuff. But I just didn't like being ordered around and talked to as I'm supposed to bark like a dog and recognize the right answer on a multiple choice test. I wanted to think about what it is I was reading. I can remember a book, and it's a wonderful book. I have a group of medical doctors that I meet with regularly and socially, and we talked about 5 novels that we read back in high school, and we all went to different places that has always stayed with us. And some of those books were Brave New World in 1984, but here's the one I want to talk about right now. William Golden, Lord of the Flies. And when I read that book, I was 14 years old. I was a freshman in high school, and some kids in another English class other than mine were all excited about the book, and guys, and they were telling us all, read this book. You got to read this book. It's great, but read it before you have to read it in class. Because if you read it in class, the English teacher is going to turn it into a Cliff Notes version of the book and tell us that the book is really about democracy. These kids are abandoned on an island and they have to, somehow govern themselves. And that's not what any of these 14-year-old boys got from that book. And they were thrilled by the book. And so I went ahead and I read it. And there's a passage in it where the boys start jumping around like they're a jungle tribe and they're beating drums and they have a fire going. And there's one child in their midst called that they've nicknamed Piggy. And Piggy wears glasses or thick glasses, and he's not as athletic as the others, and he's clumsy. And somehow they start poking him with their sticks, their lances that they had made. And he starts crying and he starts running from them. And they run after him, tormenting him. And they chase him down and kill him. And what the 14-year-old boys, and these were, a lot of athletes, from the football team and basketball team. So what amazed us all and that we talked about before the English teacher got to us was, do you think that violent instinct is in us all? That when we're in a group, if somehow things get out of control, a group think takes over, and we might become excited and enjoy doing something horrible to someone who is on the outside, maybe just because it's not at least us being attacked, or maybe we really want to do something vicious to somebody else, and there's a thrill that we as a group can do that to one of our own who we've pushed to the outside. Wow. And I remember 14-year-old boys sitting around and talking about that because on the one hand, it was really very scary that might be in us. And we talked about episodes where it seemed like we had been a part or we had seen things like that go on. And wow. No English teacher ever brought that up in class. And so the boys had told us initially, read it before the English teachers try to have you read it because they're going to tell you it's a story about democracy and blah, blah, blah. And it is a story that has important things to say about democracy, but it has something far more profound to say about human instinct. And my doctor friends and all of us they're all retired. When we talked about, there's about a dozen of them, when we talked about William Golden, we all agreed that book, The Lord of the Flies, is so much more about human instinct than it is about democracy. So I think Mark Twain was right. Don't let your schooling interfere with your education. You want a good education? Keep asking the questions. How do you know? Every time any teacher tells you something that she or he thinks that they know, or I tell you, ask the question. Yeah, how does he know that? How does she know that? How do I know that? It's the most important question you can ever ask. Okay? Match it up with that question of morality, where you're asking that question of yourself, how ought I to treat others? And you come up with some conclusions. Now, don't just leave it there. You got to ask that other question again. How do I know that this is how I ought to treat others in this context? That how do you know question is so powerful, and it is at the heart of our education. But in the four corners that you mentioned, people ought to have a disposition to readily ask the question, how do you know? Whenever they are considering any conclusion. And they ought to be skillful enough to be precise in knowing how to ask that question in just this context. COVID-19 is out there right now, gives us great examples. And so you have people talking about death rates and so on, and they're arguing political things. But what so few people are talking about is recovery. Releasing people from the hospital and saying they've recovered. Have you watched on TV some of these people hobble out of the hospital and they're called recovered? And one of the things we found out is something like 40% of them suffer chronic health problems indefinitely, which means perhaps for months or years afterwards. We don't know yet. We'll have to wait, see if they hold up for years. In the case of where there's been actual tissue scarring, scarring never goes away. If you ever cut yourself or had an operation and they sewed it back up, even with plastic surgery, you still have a small scar there. Scarring can never be removed. So if your liver, your heart, your brain is scarred as a result of COVID-19, you have that forever. So a skill in hearing that debate and making decisions about what we ought or ought not to do for people that are suffering from the disease, ought to pay attention to, wait a minute, what do you mean by the word recovered? And is there a lot of danger to people who are recovered that may get overlooked if we just focus on nothing more than death rates? So we've got dispositions, we've got the skill of asking those questions, how do you know, and what do you mean by the term so-and-so? Attitudes are important. It's got to matter to you that you're a member of a herd species, because that's what makes you want to cooperate with one another. And that's what makes you realize part of cooperation is going to involve respecting one another and expecting others to respect you as well. And information, of course, we always need information. Although too often in our schools, we settle for just delivering information. And we don't educate when that's all we do is deliver information. We just get people ready to recognize answers on a next multiple choice question. So I think Mark Twain said something very profound in his wise guy way when he said, I try to keep my schooling, preparation for the next multiple choice test, I try to keep my schooling from interfering with my education. With my education, I want to understand the world. I want to get as close as I can so that my knowledge almost touches the truth, whatever it might be in, whatever the discipline it may be in, but the truth which is outside of my own head. I got lots of stuff inside my own head, but boy, none of it can be as good as actually reaching beyond my own head, almost touching truth.
Wow, that's deep. Well, with that, Dr. Wagner, I think our focus on moral architecture ends.
All right.
What is the book's name again? One more time. The book that you just said, the Lord of the Flies. What was the
Lord of the Flies.
Lord of the Flies? Okay.
I can tell you that real quickly. The other books that the doctors and I all came up with: Lord of the Flies, Brave New World, 1984,